I'm going to actually read my paper because it's a first attempt to articulate something that I'm beginning to try to write. So I wanted to get it right. And at a certain stage, because of the technical setup, Alex is going to have to jump in and change from the large screen to the small screen so that you can watch a video I've got with some sound. But that's going to come later. I'd also like to thank the organisers of the festival for setting up such an interesting event. Okay. In this presentation, I explore the importance of scale for an understanding of the contemporary photographic image. Throughout, I'll be mostly using the term photography to name this image, though, as you will see, what we will consider brings us to the edge of what this term might mean, if not well beyond it. I do this not because I want to insist that photography is the best or the proper name for today's images, but because I want to understand the visual milieu of images, crucial to the way we form the heterogeneous and often conflicted worlds we live in and we suppose ourselves to share. And I think there are still many continuities as well as breaks in this historical narrative as it focuses on the uses to which images are put. I will draw on my own research into the roles that different notions of scale play in all of this, but also as the editor of the journal, an academic journal called Philosophy of Photography. It's clear that questions of scale have come to occupy many other research projects and visual practices that we've published recently. So I'll draw on some of these too. The talk has three parts. The first attempts to make concrete what I think is at stake in thinking about photography in terms of scale through a few historical examples. The second expands on this in the context of networked digital images. And the third sets out to explore the questions thus raised for the shifting context of the present. I set out from two premises. Firstly, that contemporary photography is a multi-layered and massively extended milieu of relations that touches upon almost every aspect of human and machine, possibly machine endeavour. In attempting to understand this, recent photographic discourse has tended to focus on the overwhelming size of contemporary photography, the vast numbers of images made and shared on a daily basis, largely on social media. My second premise complicates this commonplace by claiming that to make, look at, or use a photographic image today is to be confronted by very many different and overlapping questions and operations of scale. Hence, the focus of this talk will be on the plurality of different experiences, technical forms, and discourses of scale that underpin each and every aspect of our milieu. But what might all of this mean? The image we're looking at here is a useful starting point, insofar as it foregrounds what I would call interrelated strategies of scaling and horizons of scalability. So, in order to visualize the impact of hyperinflation on life in Venezuela in 2018, photojournalist Garcia Rollins used the standard visual strategy, placing a reference object in the camera's field of view to establish a relation of proportion and measure. But, one might ask, does the pathetic materiality of the chicken provide a measure for the banknotes against which it is pictured, or vice versa? Does the chicken measure the money, or does the money measure the chicken? This act of setting something to scale visualizes a relation of only apparent proportion, so as to imply that both terms of this relationship are situated in a broader context that is ruled by disproportion, not least because you would need a wheelbarrow to take this much money to the shop. The allusion to the conflicted geo-political context of global capitalism and the abstract form of money through which it operates problematizes the ground of reference upon which this familiar strategy of scaling rests. So, while we can observe on this basis that in a photograph things can appear commensurable in relation to one another, we also have to admit that this capacity is haunted by moments of disproportion and incommensurability. I want to explore this tension, but in order to do so, I think I need a conceptual framework. And in this light, I think it's useful to turn to the writings of the ethnographer Anna Lowenhaupt Singh and her celebrated critical distinction between scalability and non-scalability, as she wrote in 2012. I'll read it because it might be, I'll read through it. Because computers zoom across magnifications, it is easy to conclude that both knowledge and things exist by nature in precision-nested scales. The technical term is scalable, the ability to expand without distorting the framework. But it takes hard work to make the knowledge and things scalable, and ignoring non-scalable effects is a bad idea. So then she goes through her key example, which is the emergence of kind of the economic form of capitalist modernity. It's slavery, the development of plantations, and the expropriation of land from colonial subjects. These form the basis of a kind of a world that is seen to be scalable and ignores non-scalability. Note here, the important thing to note is that this ability to expand without distorting a framework applies to the technical form of computing, the material and epistemological basis upon which this might rest, the wider field of research and science that these might enable, and the historical, political, and economic forms of modernity that are their context. But seeing scalability is a fundamental cornerstone of the modern world at all of these levels. In photographic terms, one might draw a parallel here to recent critical discourse on how the mining of raw materials has enabled photography, different forms of photography. Following this thread of scalability as exploitation would potentially throw into relief non-scalable aspects of the impact of global industries that extract so-called natural resources to enable our everyday photographic practices. For the early 19th century, salt, bitumen and carbon, copper, silver. In the late 20th century, more than half of the global consumption of silver. Today, as has often been noted, rare earths and metals such as coltan, cobalt, and yttrium. So there's a photographic parallel to this discourse of scalability. Singh's book of 2015, which I highly recommend, The Mushroom at the End of the World, further develops a theory of non-scalability that begins from analysis of what she calls, quote, the work that it takes to create scalability and the messes that it makes. She writes, it is key to take note of the careers of both scalability and non-scalability. But it would be a huge mistake to assume that scalability is bad and non-scalability good. Non-scalable projects can be as terrible in their effects as scalable ones. Unregulated loggers destroy forests far more rapidly than scientific foresters. The main distinguishing feature, she writes, between scalable and non-scalable projects is not ethical conduct, but rather that non-scalable projects are more diverse because they are not geared up for expansion. This is the important point in this quotation. So these passages that I've read out have received quite a lot of attention, which has often tended to do exactly what Singh warns against here by ignoring the fact that both scalability and non-scalability as terms have a positive possibilities and are, at the same time, can be deeply problematic. So I want to use Singh's conceptual pairing to think about photography. And I want to do so, in a sense, as a way of continuing or furthering a kind of a history of the ways in which the photographic image has been thought of as caught in a series of kind of relationships, dialectics, say, between science and art, between the objective and the subjective, between expression and documentation. To make all of this more concrete, now we've got our conceptual framework in place, I will trace some key questions of scale through a short historical sequence of photographs. The first, Dwayne Michael's sequential work, Things Are Queer, of 1997, stands almost as a handbook for different operations and forms of scale that have long shaped the photographic world. It is structured around a play on scale effects, those value reversals and changes of meaning that result when our expectations of scale are confounded. Michaels sets the scene by affirming photography's ability to make a rounded material world sensible. Tacit rules grounding this world are shattered by the surreal imposition of a massive leg, which turns out to belong to a normal-sized man. We take a step back, and this imagery appears on the page of a book with a fairy tale in which a poor young man wins the hand of a princess by outwitting a giant. We take further steps back through a close-up of someone reading, and the same figure silhouetted from further back against the light at the end of a dark passageway. Another step back shifts into a close-up to flatten the field of view and impose another kind of frame, and then we're in the field of a kind of tonal changes and relationships, which bring us back. I timed those images too quickly. There was 2 seconds too fast on each one. Then we're brought back in a kind of a mise-en-abîme that brings us around in full circle to the same picture of a scruffy bathroom, which is now rendered forever strange. It's never going to be that mundane image we started out with again. It really is like a catalogue of the different ways you can think of scale in photography. This photograph was made by Robert Frank on one of the 1950s road trips that resulted in his photo book, The Americans. It is a prime example of the normative representational wholeness we've just seen ironized by Dwayne Michaels. It shows a stand of postcards on the counter of a roadside stop in the state of Nevada. From top to bottom, these show the Grand Canyon, the Hoover Dam, and a recent atomic bomb test made in the nearby desert. The sublime natural landscape, the harnessing of its power by industrial might, and the world-threatening destructive force of nuclear weapons are all brought down to representational size in the postcard, a mass historical form of photographic reproduction with its own distinctive horizons of scale. Now, there are more different ways that you could read this image, and the kind of narratives and the forms of scale that it either applies or alludes to. But in order to save time, I'm going to move on to the next image, which gives us a photo montage, Martha Rosler's Cargo Cult of 1965. This reminds us of the critical power harboured historically by photo montage and its mode of destroying other images to create new critical juxtapositions. I'm not going to labour the reading of this image here. Its scaled contrasts will be obvious to you. I show it here to bring us back to seeing this contrast between the scalable and the non-scalable. Rosler presents us with a contrast between a key figure of capitalism, then in the process of globalization, the cargo containing, and a key figure of the embodied desires its image world of consumption works upon, gendered female bodies. Reframed in terms of the contrast between scalable and non-scalable here, it strikes me that the side of the scalable should appear obvious, but what non-scalable might mean seems less easy to articulate. It doesn't appear as some ineffable quality of individual desire, nor does it really seem to denote a generalizable aspect of life, of humanity, that capitalism could never touch. Rather, reading the non-scalable out of this image suggests it means something more like something that coalesces as a point of critical resistance, that which, to recall what Sin says, threatens to be overlooked because it is diverse and not geared up for expansion. It's important to note here that whatever this coalescence of a point of resistance is, doesn't necessarily have to bear human qualities. So, drawing the first part of my talk to an end, I turn to this image. First of all, the first part of my talk, what have I tried to do? I attempted to expand upon key aspects of what scale has meant for photography. I've pointed towards the technical scaling operations of calibrated apparatuses that afford photography's images, as well as the scale effects that might undercut or enrich these. I've tried to articulate some of the material aspects of the world-spanning scope of photographic culture. And I've also hinted at some geopolitical problems of scale and the way in which artists and photographers have re-articulated these critically. My last example in this vein is an artwork by Glenn Liger, which comprises 2 life-size, full-body portraits of the artist, reproduced as screen prints and hung on the wall at about his own height. One bears this text, self-portrait exaggerating my black features. The other is called self-portrait exaggerating my white features. It's hard to tell seeing them like this, but they differ very, very slightly in terms of the contrast applied, with the former, exaggerating the black features, being printed very slightly darker than the latter. The difference is minimal, but it is enough to make the otherwise obviously identical images seem a little bit different. The effect is subtle enough that one remains unsure whether the difference results from what you're seeing or from what your attitudes are. Where does the difference lie? The whole visual system rests on the photograph's inherent propensity for exact reproduction, a certain sense of its scalability. And Ligon uses this to create a critical difference. And this reminds me that what we might usually think of scale as being exhausted, as being taken up by its task in determining the size, extent, intensity, or duration of things, it is in the end a concept of difference. All ideas and operations of scale are at root systems of differentiation. The writer Zachary Hawkins summarized this point neatly in a recent study. I quote, "Scale is difference, difference is scale," end quote. So with that, I'm going to move on to part 2 of my talk, where I'll try to expand very briefly on these questions of scale in the context of digital images and the development and consolidation of their networked character. This is the first of 2 images with which I hope to mark out key features of the digital image in the contemporary period, or quite possibly to mark at the end of an era of images, which is about or in the process of occurring. This stands predominantly for the enormously influential recent tradition of highly crafted, self-consciously aesthetic, relatively large-scale prints made in small editions for display in contemporary museums of art. The initial social and political orientation of many such related photographic projects in this kind of tradition of what gets called the tableau photographs, it was underpinned by an aesthetic tension, which worked on the one hand because of the production of this kind of image as a digital construct, as a montage, as a highly crafted art object, and on the other hand, by its seamless and highly detailed representational wholeness, by the fact that one cannot see any of the sutures. This is one side of a contrast with which I hope to characterize a certain period of the digital network photograph. This is the other. In contrast, this is a screenshot of a photograph I found online some years ago. I have no record of where it comes from. It returns no results in reverse image searches. As such, it is anonymous. It shows a metal rule, a rude knife, and a blurred mugshot laid out on the surface of a copy stand, and has multiple frames of black and white that speak of its editorial and material history. It is, to my mind, a prime example of what Hito Stale, the writer-artist, influentially named the poor image. What is distinctive for me about this particular impoverished image is that it materializes many different and layered ideas of scale. First layer. On the face of it, this is photography as institutionalized measure, the product of an unidentified penal institution's operation. It suggests itself as the record of a violent event, depicting an improvised knife that bears possible traces of use, a casually placed and cropped metal rule against which this is measured, and the mugshot of a man, victim, perpetrator, we know not, holding a blurred out nameboard to his chest. The second layer. He has been obscured by the addition of a digital filter, a blur superposed upon his image's reproduction. This image takes on a digitally specific mode of depth, a kind of depth, at least 2 photographs and 2 material processes entailing the application of visual effects, calibrated operations, are compounded in the screen image that we're looking at. The third layer, its openness to being descaled and rescaled, is patent in the various frames that the image has accrued. The casually cut white borders of the mugshot, the vertical white strip at the left side, and the black bands at top and bottom all speak ambiguously of different contexts of use and appropriation, of different materialities and acts of resizing, or otherwise de- and rescaling. And fourth and final layer, the information about this image, for us at least, is now effectively hidden amongst billions and billions of other images. So, with these two images, I want to imagine a set of scales, if you will, upon which the idea of a certain recent period of photographic images, problems and possibilities are balanced. On the one side sits Struth's large-scale, laboriously crafted, self-consciously aesthetic and highly valued photographic print. And on the other side, against this, our impoverished, devalued, yet disturbing document of a possibly violent and anonymous event that has its own aesthetic qualities. Of course, millions of other images could displace these two on the scales of digital photography. But in the present context, these two have at least got the advantage of doing so while foregrounding the structuring relations of scale that underpin the operations of images and the contrasting values we might attribute to them. Within this broad context, a further set of questions emerges from the sheer scale of the tasks which photography is expected to perform and the limits of commensurability, of proportion and measure these come up against. One, if not the most important of these, is the visualisation of climate change. Paul Nicklund's spectacular 2014 image of a melting ice cap in Norway is a prime example. Now, to be clear, I do not single this work out in order to criticise it. On the contrary, I think it's an amazing photograph. It's an image that stems from the committed practice of a highly skilled photographer. I use it here to stand as an example of the best that photography might be able to do in finding ways to directly represent and thus affect the scale of impending ecological disaster. It employs all of these aesthetic qualities to stage a sublime view on an event of massive physical scale and enormous significance. But surely I'm by no means the only one, or the first to remark, that the link between this kind of representation, its aesthetic strategies and effects, seems severed when we might expect them to have some political agency. As I.L. Weissman noted in a recent essay on geopolitics and military conflict, the governing concept of our age seems to be disproportion rather than what one might expect, a desire for proportion. This brings with it structurally similar problems that we've just looked at with climate change of commensurable representation to those just discussed. This is Thomas Hirschon's 2007 disturbing graphic, violent artwork, The Incommensurable Banner. And it engages these kind of questions of geopolitical incommensurability critically. It's made from stitched together sheets of cloth. It's 4 meters tall and 18 meters long. On it are pasted a range of pictures culled from online contexts showing dead and mutilated bodies destroyed by modern technologies of warfare. It's a disgusting thing to look at. This scaled, it operates a kind of a scaled use of the gallery wall and space. And its low-tech presentation of images sourced online, this combination seems to embody the metaphor of a balance, a scale I've just attempted to construct between these two prior images, between the tableau photograph and the poor image. Furthermore, we might note the banner is designed, as we see in this image, so that it can be rolled up at one end to fit different spaces of display. This has the powerful, decidedly lo-fi effect of rendering this set of horrifying images potentially infinite. There's always going to be more horrors that can be revealed as we unroll the banner. Now, we're going to have to skip this very, very interesting series of images by another image by Thomas Hirschon in order to move on and get to this. I want to return to the topic of the enormous and expansive horizon, the scale of today's image culture, which writers, when they write about this, often exemplify with reference to this image, with Eric Kessel's 24 Hours in Photos, an installation work comprising 350,000 small prints of images that Kessel's, or his assistants, cull from social media on a given day and install like this in the gallery. Now, 350,000 photographic prints is a lot, and yet it is tiny in comparison to the horizon of visual culture that it sets out to figure. The installation applies an aesthetic scale to the broader historical and technical situation of photography by taking a partial element, 24 hours of picnic photos, to evoke this otherwise unpresentable, enormous horizon of photography as such. It's a metonym, taking a part for a whole, and metonyms are, after all, prime operators of scale. A similar approach structures Evan Roth's more recent Since You Were Born, which turns the focus of this kind of metonymic strategy to present images from his own internet browsing data. The internet cache of 4 months of search history from the day his second daughter was born in 2016. So these are all images resulting from his search history. Now, there's something about the specific material these two strategies, Kessel's and Roth, adopt for dealing with the expansive size, the scale of network digital photography that is undoubtedly effective. It's an impressive thing to be amongst. But somehow, I can't help but feel also destined to remain inadequate. And without wanting to force the parallel, I think that they trade on the potential of a large series of small photographic prints to generate an experience of overwhelming scale. But in doing this, they seem to misrecognize the character of the image worlds they set out to imagine and comment upon. The material basis of their works seem to belong to an older image world, this kind of small material print. So now, we've reached the end of part 2. I'll turn to part 3 of the talk to explore questions of scale that seem more determining in the formation of today's visual milieu. An article we published last year in the Philosophy of Photography by Xiong Yui, a Helsinki-based artist and researcher, articulates this situation nicely. Yui's object of analysis is the significance of images generated using machine learning frameworks, such as the generative adversarial networks. His specific focus is on these images as used in the website thispersondoesnotexist.com, and his aim is to theorize these in relation to Timothy Morton's notion of the hyperobject, which we'll leave to one side. This person does not exist. This website, as you no doubt already know, is a creation of a software engineer, Philip Wang, and it generates a new image of a human face with every refresh of the browser. The point being that each photorealistic face with which one is confronted is machine generated and has no representational correlative in an existing person, has no reference to the real world. So, discussing these, starting out from my own characterization of the importance of scale for images in the age of computer vision and networked culture, Reed begins by articulating interlaced scales of the visual image, the pixel and the network, the visual image, and the levels of analysis and imagination that these encourage. He then takes this insight in different directions, referring to the epistemological framing of the world at specific scales of observation by different disciplines. And he uses this as a basis from which to project new forms of image, which he goes on to situate as follows, and I'll read a passage from the lower part of this paragraph. As images expand beyond the moment of capture, are processed en masse in greater than human scale and created through data, infrastructure, and social networks distributed across time and space, they exceed the disciplinary apparatuses that may have previously framed them on the phenomenological scale of the human. I'll move on to comment on the next part before articulating what I think of this. He develops a particularly acute kind of critical theoretical approach to thinking these relations, I think. Particularly when it turns to consideration of the novelty of the images that he places in question and the implications these have for the way we make, the way we form our visual worlds. So I'll read this. New media articulate new scales. That's what new media do, in a sense. The advent of computer vision produces a new set of operations on images at both larger and smaller than human scales. GAN-generated images, GAN-generated faces, exemplify the multifarious nature of images. Depending on the scalar frame, an image is both visual and non-visual, experiential and programmable. An object on its own are part of an extensive network. So I'll end the quote. This situates this kind of historical discourse of scale that I've tried to articulate in relation to our present. Now, at risk of labouring a set of critical kind of contrasts and discourses that this particular audience will probably be very familiar with, key questions of scale emerge in relation to the visual data sets necessary to the kind of machine learning that produces these images, such as the data set ImageNet, one of the largest and most influential, a collection of more than 14 million images scraped, appropriated from the internet, labelled by Amazon Mechanical Turk crowd workers, and organised into 21,000 categories. An enormous repository of images upon which such artificial intelligence is learn how to do what they're set to do. Problems of scale in this context have been often associated, firstly, with the fact that appropriating these images from their online courses entails unauthorized taking of images on a huge scale, like often from social media accounts. Secondly, that once appropriated, the images need to be labeled or tagged by human beings in order that they can be read by a machine, in order to be usable for the taxonomic structure of the data set and its function as a mechanism of machine training. And thirdly, there's a problematic with the forms of bias that these systems and processes, these kind of appropriations and modes of labeling, there's questions of bias that these systems incorporate into the supposedly neutral construction of the data sets. Okay, there's been a lot of critical discourse in the last few years about these problems. Now, once again, I don't expect that observing this in this particular context is going to be news to you. The point is, rather than expecting that, is to explore how the processes, problems, and possibilities of scale specific to these might grant us some kind of critical purpose, might help us think about the worlds that are being constructed in and through these new processes. So, we're looking at an installation shot of Trevor Paglin's work From Apple to Anomaly, Pictures and Labels, Selections from the ImageNet Dataset for Object Recognition, as installed in the London Barbican Gallery Curve. It's a curve, it's a huge, long, curved space. And we're looking at one end of this photographic installation. To return to ImageNet. In an often quoted comment, Professor Fai Li, the creator of ImageNet, noted that due to the enormous scale and the amount of processing involved, it would take one person who didn't sleep, looking at a couple of images a second, over 19 years to label all of them. And that's quite an ambitious kind of estimate, it strikes me. So the massive labour of labelling of this data set was outsourced to the workers on the Amazon Mechanical Turk, human beings set to perform this task. Critically exploring the results, this work From Apple to Anomaly works on the principle that, as Paglin has described it, every time you create a taxonomy, a set of categories through which to order objects of knowledge, there's a politics to it. Because when you're creating a taxonomy, you're saying, this is a range of categories that are intelligible, we can understand them. And it's always going to be a limited range. In doing this, you're always creating a negative space, the things that are outside of your categories, the things that are not intelligible. In the interview from which this previous quotation is taken, Paglin goes on to situate the critical exploration of how the scale effects of ImageNet in terms of the power of world formation. That sentence doesn't make sense. He goes on to explain, to talk about these kind of critical problems with what's included and excluded in taxonomic structures of this particular kind of use of images, how that always produces these biases and specifically with regard to these images, how that contributes to the formation of new visual worlds. Okay, so here we're going along the curve of this gallery, looking at the extent of this work. Pagan said, right, when we start looking at ImageNet, we start to see a worldview coming into view, a world that is contained within this training set of images itself. We have the overall taxonomy, but then we can look at the individual categories. What kinds of concepts become real by getting a class within the training set and having images attached to these? Things like an apple might be relatively uncontroversial, but as we go further, it gets stranger and stranger. So literally, we've started out from the left-hand side, the right-hand side of this exhibition with apples, and we're moving from apples to anomalies through categories. One's progress along the wall display of thousands of images brings one from benign and neutral-seeming categories of apples to several to increasingly strange categories that display the kind of bias and prejudice that Pagan describes. He talks about a woman on holiday on the beach has been labelled a kleptomaniac. A photograph of a man in a bar is labelled a loser. Alex. Yeah. Yes, I think you're on. Can I ask you to change the screen? I'll just talk. The last slide that I have entails a video with sound, so we need to actually change screens. I apologise for introducing that difficulty. But I could talk over that. So with regard to the Pagan work and this novel kind of horizon of a set of problems of scale, we're dealing with the specific kind of problems of constituting knowledge, epistemological categories, and building knowledge that always somehow also exhibits whatever bias exists and is an act of exclusion at the same time. But we're also dealing with a larger framework of how this large set of images and those like different kind of operations that are similar, how these enormous processes build worlds. So along with appropriating millions of specific images and perhaps enacting lots and lots of small injustices, there's a sense in which this entire history that I've tried to articulate, all of these kind of possibilities of, all of these processes of what we've been trying to think of in terms of scalability, points of resistance in terms of non-scalability, also get swept up into this new form. Now that's what I'm trying to get towards thinking. I don't think I expressed that very, very clearly, but that's what I'm trying to get to thinking in this paper and in the piece of writing that it's working towards. And the piece of work that inspired it is a remarkable installation. Still on pattern. I have to skip a couple of images, however interesting they are. We don't have time to talk about them. It's a remarkable installation by the artist Gregory Jatonsky, works in France, called Completion 1.0. This brings my talk to an end. And I'm going to talk about it in relation to, and it's the thing that inspired me to think of this idea that I've just expressed kind of fairly clumsily, and hopefully it'll enable me to articulate it better. I discussed this work in light of an article by Antonio Somaini that we published in Philosophy of Photography last year, called On the Photographic Status of Images Produced by Generative Adversarial Networks. In this article, Somaini sets out to analyse the persistence of photographic ideas of the image in such artworks. In what I'm going to say now, I'm drawing very closely on this article. The overarching project to which completion contributes, as Somaini has it, and I quote, it's about repairing, completing, predicting, generating the whole of human history by proposing indefinite alternative versions of it. So in a sense, this work, on the basis of Samani's reading of it, it does what I'm trying to think. So it's exemplary of something about our contemporary moment in photographic history, technologies of imaging, and the massive shifts it entails. But what is it? So the installation comprises a metal framework with two video screens. The screen on the floor that we see here shows a fast-changing series of images. It sequences all 14 million images from the ImageNet database, which even at speed would potentially take years to finish. As Chetonsky talks of the way this image is supposed to cover almost the entire world. The fact that no spectator will ever be able to see the entire sequence of 14 million images is for him a way of underlining the unbridgeable gap between human perceptual experience and this endless flow, this abundance of materials that are accumulated on the web. The vertical screen shows a series of images deriving from what Samani describes the latent space that's produced in this this adversarial process opposing the generator and the discriminator in the GAN process. We would fast get towards the limits of my technical knowledge if we talk about them more technically. But the point is other. From this space, from this relation, Chetonsky extracts hybrid images by slowly mixing, by slowly kind of encouraging this relationship between the generator and the discriminator to consider the different categories in the ImageNet data set. And over this, okay, I'm going to play. This is a very speedily flashing image. So if any of you have problems with flashing images, you might want to not watch it. So here are the 14 million images. We're going to get to the end. The other video, not playing it, shows that this morphing, changing construct, a hybrid image that mixes the different categories that order this data set. And it has a voice. The voice reads out text produced by another neural network that's trained with a database of hundreds of texts dealing with the history and theory of photography, such as Susan Sontag's On Photography or Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida. The voice describes or theorizes the image produced by the GANs, sometimes seeming to refer to the particular images and sometimes drifting into nonsense. When the image is this, or this is part of the morphing into an image of something with a bird-like face, the corresponding French language description is as follows. I'll play a little bit of it, but I've also got a translation I can read.
L'âme a été déformée par le vent qui a fait apparaître les ailes comme si elles avaient été coupées de l'oiseau et accrochées à lui comme un collier. Sur le second côté, on voit les ailes qui sont restées suspendues au cou de l'aile à un voilé par rapport à l'autre, comme si leurs embouts aigus avaient été coupés. Les serres ont été coupées, tandis que les ailes ne sont pas.
The video is still moving, but I'll turn down the sound to read the translation. It's not a bird. It doesn't particularly look like a bird at the moment, but it will at some point. It's not a bird, but a soul. The text says, the voice speaks. A soul that has been deformed by the wind and that has made wings appear, as if they had been separated from the bird and hung on it like a necklace. We can see the wings that remained hanging from the neck of the straight-nailed eaglet, one in relation to the other, as if the sharp beak had also been cut. The image is very reminiscent of a photograph showing a hawk in full flight, and it goes on and on and on over kind of a period of hours, articulating such interpretations, theoretical frameworks in relation to the images generated. So, this is my destination. This is where I wanted to get to in articulating this kind of history, this rethinking the history of photography, its transition into digital networked imagery, and it's kind of the point of flux, the point of change that we're at now, where machine learning and AI are throwing everything in the air and potentially changing everything. One of the frustrating points I kind of find often in talking about contemporary imaging technologies, contemporary photography, is the way in which there's a tendency to ditch everything, to want to kind of describe the past as kind of, it's obsolete, we're done and dusted with it, we've got to start again completely from new. But what I see in these kind of practices, what I've been trying to build towards, is a sense in which, maybe not in an obvious way, but a sense in which this moment of transition is being reformed around such historical ideas in photography that I've tried to articulate. They're being incorporated in it and in significant ways. So, by way of conclusion, I'd like to say that the questions of scale I've tried to articulate through a certain critical history of photography, they were always a feature of photography, from its earliest days. Okay. But they only really became questions, they only really became important questions with the development of digital imaging technologies, their consolidation in the form of networked images, and subsequent developments in computer imaging, machine vision, and AI. In these shifting image ecologies, the various different questions of scale I've attempted to outline are more and more important. They were kind of dormant in the history of photography, and they've come to the front. And so I think focusing on this fact, this emergent kind of importance of thinking about things in terms of scale, these new scales at which things are operating, at which the world is being reformed, are very important, because at the moment, the past is being refigured as an element of the constitution of a future. Far from being obsolete and distant from us, the worlds that the past, the history of photography shows to us, are currently in the process of being taken up, reconfigured, and projected into the future as cornerstones in the formation of the new worlds we will come to live in. So that was my conclusion.